Welcome to, I think, what's going to be a really interesting conversation about difficult conversations. I really love this presentation because it calls us to really think about how we can tune all facets of our communication to topics that can be hard to engage in. So, we're going to take some time to dig into the moments where it's difficult to empathize, where it's difficult to hear things, but how we can lean into these conversations and and be supportive. For those of you that I may not have met, my name is Paul Porter. I am assistant speech coach at Bishop Dwenger High School here in Fort Wayne. But also in my spare time, I am also the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of St. Francis. So my work calls me to wear a multitude of hats and also serve in roles that utilize my subject matter expertise, which is in intercultural communication, interpersonal communication, as well as topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like I said, this is a presentation that is designed to get us thinking about how we lean into, listen to, empathize, and also support those that are in the midst of tough conversation. I've got a couple of activities and things for us to read through and consider as we learn about what a dialogue is, what can make dialogue difficult, but also how to engage in one on a challenging conversation. Before we begin, there are a few, not necessarily ground rules, but I think certainly conditions that we should consider. One, this is a safe space, at least as far as I can create one. I'm not going to punish you for anything that you think, say, or feel because I don't have the means to do that. But also, I want you to know that there is both a level of comfort and discomfort. Comfort in the sense that we're not all together right now. We are here on a Zoom screen and not face to face. And so there is a little bit of comfort in saying what you feel and putting your thoughts out there. But there's also a level of discomfort in the sense that we are reading news cycles right now, engaging in conversations face to face on social media, watching our television, reading our newspapers, engaging in our social media, and realizing that for some of us, there are thoughts, feelings, experiences that make us, one, uncomfortable, but two, are not aligned with how we feel about the world from a social perspective, from a political perspective, from an economic perspective. So you name the topic: Trump, COVID, law enforcement, violence, what lives matter. We have at our fingertips a host of different things to discuss. And while you may sit in the comfort of your own home, the reality is that these conversations are not comfortable. So I'm not only going to ask you to sit in a safe space, but I want you to make this a brave space. And as you go back to your students and your coaches, make the spaces that your team inhabit, make those brave also. These won't always be comfortable spaces. But the hope is that we can have the guts to both speak and listen. Also recognize that we are standing on what some would call the edge of learning. We are at a space where we can hear each other, that we can connect with others, that we can understand experience, build both empathy and sympathy. It is at what we call the learning edge where we are most often open to listening, where we're most open to expanding our minds and understanding the realities of others. Hence the need to be okay with this being a space that is brave and not always comfortable. Finally, let's recognize the conflict is normal. Now, I should stop myself and remind myself that I am talking to speech and debate coaches. We don't mind a good conversation. We don't mind a good argument. My hope is that within that, we recognize that when we feel safe and we feel like the people around us are committed to learning, that's where we will work best, especially when we are in disagreement. That's not just a condition for this presentation. I want you to think of it as a condition for your coaching sessions, your team practices, your team meetings, but also the opportunities where we get to come together as an organization and engage with each other. We don't have to agree, but can we at least be committed to hearing each other? There are a few documents that I have left for you in the material section that will align with this presentation. And if you go to the before we begin things to know about dialogue handout, you will see a fuller description of the idea of the safety perspective, the comfort zone, as well as the learning edge and conflict. To get us started, I want you to take a moment while you are looking at those resources. Take a moment to read the parable of the ups and downs. Take a moment to read the parable of the ups and downs, and then we're going to come back. I had some questions to facilitate a little bit of discussion. So I'll give you a minute or two to find, pick up, and read that parable. I want us to think about how this activity applies, or how this activity applies to speech and debate. Think of the parable as metaphor for members of our community. We can keep it local. We'll say the state community. Say the state as a whole, just to make it interesting. The first question I have is, in our activity, as in our community, I'll start using the word community, who are most likely to be ups and who are most likely to be downs? And for those of you that have been in the speech community for a while, how appropriate that this is the parable of the ups and downs. I'll ask the question again. I'd love to hear your thoughts. In our community, who are most likely to be ups and who are most likely to be downs?
I'll bite. I think programs. I look at it as programs that have multiple coaches and are completely like over-resourced are ups, and those of us who are I feel like some of us have a chip on our shoulder, for lack of a better term, and are fighting hard to just be able to show up and practice and drag some kids to a meet. So I think that's one of the perceptions I have. So
okay, good. We're off to the race. Who else? Who are ups? Who are downs?
Hey, Paul, I would say sometimes I see ups and downs in terms of successful programs, meaning your kids are placing every year. You've coached XYZ number of state champions, national qualifiers, whatever, versus everyone else.
Oh, I like that. There can be that there's this distinction that the ups are in some way separate from the rest of the world. Yeah, I like that.
That kind of goes for individual competitors too, not just a whole program, but just when kids are or when anyone's successful, then they're an up.
And the students that don't win as often are at all considered the down. You all are setting me up really well for the second question. What are some of the issues faced by downs in our community?
I think in all those cases, I would say exclusion leading to burnout. I think that both speaks to programs that Rothrock mentioned earlier. I think in individuals too. I mean, I think I competed in discussion as a competitor, And if you weren't part of that like elite upper group, sometimes you're like, fine, I don't want to. If I can't be part of that clique, I'm going to move to another event.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we have students who we have to really preach to and say, I don't care who's in the room with you.
Mm-hmm.
They walk in and they see those competitors that have beat them week after week after week, and they immediately think, well, I didn't get the one.
Mm-hmm.
They've already prejudged themselves.
I find it interesting, though, what I'm hearing so early on, right off the bat, is that competitive success equates to voice. Because I would imagine, well, let me move on to the next question. I think that this will tie together really well. Where have you seen downs? Where have you seen downs communicate their downness? And what are some of their concerns?
I can tell you on my team, and you used to coach with us, so you know the story, and you graduated from BP. It is the discussion that we have to have. Ben Davis is probably one of the most heavily African American teams in the state, and we have to sit down as a coach. I have to sit down and have the talk with them, and let them understand that the material that we cover and the stories that we tell, which are our stories, everyone isn't going to receive well. And they can still be the best kid in the round and still get the lowest score in the round. And that's the thing that they talk about. And on the bus, we have to be aware of that. And so from my experience, and it's kind of I don't know, it's kind of difficult because whereas we have that conversation as one of our downs, but as a successful team, we're one of the ups as well. And so it's a mixed bag. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting that you can have down pieces within an up community. Fred, I think of my first year with you and coming back from the state tournament. We had a state runner up in an event, and we looked at the scores of the final rounds, and it wasn't so much the disparity in the scores, because state final round scores are all over the place, but where the low scores came from, and the fact that we could almost predict who, before even looking at codes to look up schools, that we could almost predict, yeah, I bet you that the 6 amongst the 3 1s and the 2s, the 2 6s came from here and here, and we looked them up, and we either were dead on or close.
Yep.
And so I think that does say a lot. And in this case, the down is not necessarily from a social perspective as much as it's from a competitive perspective, but also from an authoritative perspective, because it's the coach or the judge with power over the student. And so as ups live in their upness, it's hard to think about how we can yield power over others, despite the fact that there are downs in up communities. How do you think that ups engage with downs in our community? Do ups engage with downs in our community?
I've been thinking a lot of the ups and downs in terms of the networking piece of the parable, where it says the downs don't organize, and when they do, they're looked at suspiciously, and the ups are networked well together.
Yes.
And so in thinking of it from that perspective, the number of times that we've sat in state council meetings or general sessions and talked about, in vague terms, the small schools, the growing programs, in ways where we're not hearing the voice from necessarily a small school or a growing program. We're attributing characteristics to them and speaking on their behalf because we are the ups who are networked. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the general meeting.
Mm. And so, which I think is a really great, it's a great example of dumb upness, which was my next question, which was my last question. What are some examples of dumb upness? And so kudos for answering two questions with one answer. I think that it says a lot about the, I don't want to say uninformed perspective, but I see this also when we talk about competitive trends, and I've seen this at the high school and college level. I've been to many conferences and meetings where we talk about what's winning and what's not, what's within the rules and what's within the convention. And I can't remember what year it was, but I sat in one of those conversations and someone finally had the bravery to raise a hand and say, I'm sorry, you're all leading this conversation about what wins and what doesn't and what's successful and what's not, yet I never see any of you with a ballot in your hand. You walk right into the school and straight into the tab room. How do you know what wins? How do you know what conventions are if you are so disassociated from the rest of the community, yet you get the opportunity to speak on the community? And now, typically, when we say difficult dialogue, what we really mean at times is taboo. The things that we cannot say out loud out of fear that we might be removed from our upness or that we will be forced to remain in our downness. And so there's almost this sense that you have to have a nothing to lose attitude in order to actually speak up for the downs.
And Paul?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree, or could you give me your commentary on this? And I think that's the reason why people have a problem with Trump, because he's saying what has never been said out loud. And people who agree with that are agreeing with that. And people who are uncomfortable and don't agree with it are uncomfortable about it. And they don't necessarily know, how do you address this? How do we talk about this? How do we attack this in a way that isn't offensive?
I do agree. I think that we have in our minds a standard approach to conversation on any topic, and when it applies to that which is taboo, we realize that there are, if you think about it, we love small talk. We get to, and we see it when we get to tournaments. We will get in to a tournament. I know I'm jumping around a little bit. We'll get to a tournament, and what do we instantly jump onto? Sports, news, weather, and how are your kids? We won't get into, because that's easy. We know the formula to talk about the Colts, the Pacers, and Notre Dame football, IU basketball, and the Indy 500. We know how to talk about, we know how to engage in conversation about the fact that it's freaking cold on the bus and we had an hour and a half drive. But when it comes to talking about whether or not Bob Woodward's book is accurate and Trump really did know about COVID in February and purposefully tried to play it down, it's hard to work the playbook for that conversation because I don't know how you feel. And when we work in spaces like speech and debate, we're working in spaces where the consequence of our action affects not just us, but also affects our students. And it can be tough because we have things that we want to say, we have experiences that we want to share, but we don't know how. Or we know exactly what we want to say and do, but we know that there's consequence. And I think that that's where a lot of people are getting hung up when having discussions about Donald Trump or responding to Trump. They know that there's consequence there. Some are willing to have the conversation. Some of us feel like we need to have it, and some of us are afraid to, because we recognize that in a dialogue, we run the risk of potential consequence. Regardless, I think that there is nothing more important to remember than this. Right and wrong are secondary to why. Here's what I mean by that. What draws together the beauty of diversity is difference, which means that we are all different people with different identities, different worldviews and perspectives. And we all, in the context of speech and debate, want to share those perspectives, whether it's which teams have resources or which topics deserve to be listened to fairly. We get so caught up in the rules. We get so caught up in what's right and what's wrong. We get so caught up in opinions that what we fail to recognize is why people are saying what they are saying. 45% of communication is listening. And I don't want us to go through this presentation thinking that it is a presentation about talking. It's a presentation about how we listen to people. We're educators, we are coaches, we are judges, we are leaders. It's time for us to think about what others have to say. Dialogue is an interesting monster. It actually has a couple definitions. It's the thing that takes place in between characters in books, plays, or movies. It's also a conversation or discussion that's designed to resolve a problem. And what I really appreciate about dialogue is actually its Greek meaning, dia meaning through, logos meaning. I know I have an etymologist in the room, so I tread lightly. I like to think of dialogue as the flow of meaning, because in dialogue, we have the opportunity to think together in space, to create new and shared meaning, but to also recognize that there is no final position and that there can sometimes be no certainty, that there are multiple possibilities. And that if we listen to each other, we can be in relationship with each other. And that part of being in relationship with each other is the trust and vulnerability that comes with listening. I think it is safe to assume that if we buy into that parable of the ups and the downs, it's safe to assume that we have not done the best possible job of listening to all the voices that come together in spaces. And so we can use this conversation on dialogue to think about the way that we listen to people and the way that we accept different worldviews into our circles. Dialogue, debate, and discussion are three different things. By the way, there is a handout associated with this slide that shows all of the characteristics that separate discussion from debate and dialogue. If you look at these three boxes, these three sets of characteristics, think about the conversations that you have on your team. Think about the conversations that you have on your bus. Think about the conversations you have in practice sessions. And think of what you're striving to have. I currently help coach a team that's very discussion heavy. And it's interesting because in discussion practices, and when I think of our discussers, it's funny because I believe that sometimes they confuse discussion with debate because there is a competitive perspective. Dialogue, if you think about it, is so listening heavy. It centers around shared meaning. It centers around trying to find agreement, but not always agreeing. Recognize that there are different opinions and perspectives out there, but also being introspective enough to challenge our own biases so that we can listen and that we can validate and listen without judgment. What separates dialogue from discussion and debate is that in a dialogue, we recognize that we're not going to solve anything immediately. and that we have to hear in order to progress. We have to listen in order to progress as well. And so if you think about this in the context of speech and debate, we can ask the simple question, are we listening to each other? Are the big schools listening to smaller schools? Are we inviting new coaches into our leadership spaces? Are we making room for those who aren't coaching at teams that have multiple state champions and national qualifiers? And are we giving enough professional development opportunities to those who are struggling to get more than 2 people on a team? Some of the things that we can consider when we engage in dialogue. Can we be a container? Can we create a pool of shared meaning by mixing our thoughts with others? I usually, in face-to-face versions of this presentation, I like to use Kool-Aid as a visual aid, as in, can we put water into a container, and can we add mix, and can we add sugar, and can we twirl it around to create some new and shared meaning? And then I'll add ice, and then we all have Kool-Aid. Unfortunately, we're virtual, and I didn't want to torture you all, and so we're leaving that part out today. Can we create spaces where people are safe to speak? What I love about Fred's question about Trump is that it leads me to an answer that suggests that the reason that Downs don't always speak up is because of the fear of what the ups will do to them. And so we fall in line. We say the popular thing. We say the acceptable thing, which isn't always the evolutionary or revolutionary thing, but we say it to keep ourselves out of trouble. So for those of us that find ourselves as members of the IHSFA leadership or sectional leadership, what's happening to ensure a space where people can speak up? Are we showing individuals that they are equal, that they are wanted? Are we paying attention to triggers? Are we suspending assumptions? And are we listening with empathy? If we can listen to the voices of others, when Fred talks about having to talk to his kids about the ways in which bias may seep into a judge and potentially unfairly lead to a low rank, when Fred voices those concerns, do we listen to Fred with a desire to understand, be introspective, and think, wow, I really need to talk to my judges about the way they respond to, on a ballot, students of color, because while they may not necessarily be Ben Davis kids, they may be kids from a brand new team that have something to say. We have our own version, I think, of Ben Davis here in Fort Wayne, a team that is majority minority. And so we have those moments too, where we have to think to ourselves, are we really listening to what the student has to say through the literature, through the speech, through the impromptu, through the extemp, what they say at the discussion table? And are we creating a space that is safe for them and encouraging them to speak up? You put a 6 on a critique sheet in a POI on racism and violence and say, this is such an angry piece, we don't need to hear these things right now. What you basically told the student is to sit down and shut up and do something that I want to hear. And I'll reward that. The brain responds accordingly to reward. It is the dopamine in our brains. If we can listen with empathy, if we can write the critique that says, I love the way you perform this, you're so talented. Your character pops are amazing. I love your source citations. Your structure's really tight. I will admit, I don't like what you're saying, but you present so well. If we can do that, we can challenge ourselves to be fair while also still being able to have room to have an opinion. But when our container becomes segmented and we silo each other off, we put people in a position where we have to tiptoe around a hierarchy. It doesn't lead to anything very productive. If we're going to have an effective dialogue, there's some questions that we need to ask ourselves. And before we even step into that conversation, so when this comes to the conversations that we have with our coaches, the conversations we have as an organization, conversations we have with our students, with other coaches, with judges, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is it necessary, and what are we trying to accomplish? What do we know about another person? And we got to read nonverbals during the conversation to make sure that what we are trying to say is getting across appropriately, but also to make sure that people are hearing us and that we are hearing others in the right way. And so we paraphrase for the sake of understanding. We'll say things like, what you are saying is this. Am I hearing that? Am I hearing that correctly? Sometimes I write that on critique sheets, by the way. I'll write something like, this line in your informative, I am hearing you say this in this way. Am I hearing that right? If so, consider this. If not, consider this. Little things like that can really help people think about the way that they communicate. Because just because a down has something to say that may be difficult or hard to hear, it doesn't necessarily mean that the way they are communicating is always the best. Also, during communications, we can offer people to say more. During conversation, we can offer what are called say more responses, asking people to share more, and we can also use what are called I messages instead of you or but messages. When we do that, we are taking ownership for how we feel, as opposed to blaming someone else for our feelings, or using a but message which dismisses or invalidates someone's feelings. This is all part of creating the safe space that opens up the conversation and creates more opportunity for us to listen as well as learn. When we are defensive against that that challenges us, we're telling people that our way is going to be the way, is going to be the standard. But when we are open to or invite more, we are telling an individual, I want to hear what you have to say. It hurts me to hear it, but I want to know more so that I can learn and I can grow and I can help. Some things that you want to avoid, and I feel like we've talked about this already a little bit, but some things that we want to avoid are judgments and labels. We don't want to exaggerate, and we don't want to demand of people. If individuals are sharing their perspective, we probably don't want to put too many demands on them because we have already used up a lot of their emotional labor. As we are in conversation with people and we're sharing our perspective, we might want to be weary of judgments and exaggeration. I always love tentative language because it allows me to say, this is my perspective. This is not the law. So when I use the I could be wrong example, it's my way of inviting people to say, your voice is welcome here too. Let me just share what I know. We can encourage testing and tell people that we're willing to listen if they have a different explanation. We can apologize when appropriate. I think if we sat down and crafted a list, we could find a lot of people in our current communities, as well as our speech and debate community, that deserve apologies. I know there are a few people I need to say I'm sorry to, maybe for not being a good listener, for approaching a difficult conversation inappropriately, maybe taking something too personally, or maybe accusing someone of taking something personally. I know that I have my apologies. I'm sure that we all do if we really thought about it. And maybe in this time right now where we are all vulnerable, where we are mired in uncertainty, this might be a good time to reach out to someone and say, hey, I'm really sorry. when we had a conversation about this, I behaved in a way that is just not like me. Here's why I did it. I own it. Please forgive me. When it comes to coming to resolution, sometimes we have to identify a problem. We have to decide on ways that will fit the needs of those involved, solve the problem, but also make some commitments. Difficult conversation can lead to action if both sides are willing to listen to each other and engage fairly. But those conversations are pointless if there's no action behind them. It is possible for a good conversation on a challenging topic to just be reduced to empty language. It's in these moments I like to use the distinction between non-racism and anti-racism. You're going to hear those phrases a lot as we continue to talk about police brutality, the destruction of Black and brown bodies, things like that, policy, systemic change, and those types of topics. You'll hear people talk about being non-racist or anti-racist. Non-racist is a public or private declaration that racism is bad. Anti-racism is when we implement policies, procedures, long-term change that dismantles racism. It's one thing to say, thank you for sharing your piece with me. I'm going to give it consideration. Or saying, thank you for performing. I will let you give your whole performance. There's a difference between that and I'm going to put in a policy that says this needs to be listened to and rewarded. Or I'm going to walk out of the room and I'm going to do exactly what you propose in your solutions in your oratory. So not only do we need to hear the difficult conversation, hear the difficult topic, we also have to make some concrete commitments to action. So we're coming to some sense of resolution. Appropriately, it is 12:50 on the dot. And if you'll allow, I'd love to, just for a couple minutes, take some questions, hear your comments, and your candor on this topic. So I'm going to come out of the screen share, come chat with you all a bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, Paul, I was just sitting here thinking, as you were talking about all this stuff and the difficult conversations and whatnot, we can actually also apply what you're talking to the pieces that we choose to run with our kids and having those discussions surrounding how we coach those pieces, how they write their oratories, what topics they go after. Because, and you know, we did this at BD, you know, we had to have those discussions with the kids because we're going to open up and have a difficult one-sided conversation with the speech community. So whatever they see, you know what I'm saying, is the message or the conversation we want to have. How are they going to receive that conversation? Mm-hmm. Whether it's your oratory or poetry or DI.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of the activity. If we can encourage that in our students, we have an opportunity to encourage them to really make us think of the things that they have to say. Thank you, Fred.
I also wonder myself, you know, are we really coaching audience analysis? You know, that's something that we should teach in college. We teach in college speech, and you probably teach in high school speech, but how are we really coaching audience analysis? And then how are we practicing audience analysis in this organization when we're talking to each other? I think those are things too that we need to consider as we go too.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's it. It really should. I think of this from when I teach the basic public speaking course. Mm-hmm. For me, that's at the center of everything. Yeah. Not just audience analysis, but audience centeredness, mm-hmm. which leads to then the leads to hopefully the recognition that our audiences are diverse, that our audiences come from different spaces and places. And even, if you think about it, when you write a critique, you are having a one-on-one conversation.
Yes.
And do we think about how our words land when we write a critique? Do we think about what "I don't like your topic" says to the bisexual young lady that is doing a poi and the mental process of coming through this? Do we think about what we are saying to a student when we say, "It looks like you got your suit from Goodwill"? Are we considering the audience that we are giving that message to? Thank you, Matt. That's a great observation. Other thoughts? Linda just poked me in the eye.
I think if we can have difficult conversations and help our kids have those, then they'll find it's easier, and maybe then we'll see more people having conversations instead of being afraid to speak up.
I agree. And I think that socially, I've noticed that, especially as a diversity educator and as a diversity professional, it's hard sometimes to encourage conversation because there's a lot of, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And my response to that is, I need you to say the wrong thing so that I can educate you. If everyone feels the same way, then I'm not needed. And part of that is, unfortunately, our tendencies to shoot people down when their perspective is unpopular. It's why I love the idea of dialogue and inviting the win-win, because when you say to someone, we can disagree, but we can still respect each other. When we stand on that edge of learning, we feel more comfortable saying things out loud. I've got the two head coaches that I have worked under in my 5 years in this organization in the room right now. And I think they can both agree. It's interesting because they both have the same hairstyle, and that makes me happy because they share my hairstyle. Thank you, you two bald, beautiful men. I've got a thing for apparently coaching under bald men. I think they would both say that we've had our share of disagreements on how things should get done because we come from different places. We come from different spaces. We come from different identities. And at the end of the day, I love them both like they're brothers I never asked for, and respect them both for the experts and wonderful gentlemen that they are. And we can have those disagreements without confrontation, which is why we have them so freely.
And I think our teams are better because we can have them freely and talk about it without them bubbling under the surface and eventually coming out in a more terrible way.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. If I write on, I'll tell you right now, because I judge a lot of rounds. If I judge one of your kids and I come after the literature, I'm not coming after the kid, and I'm not coming after you. I'm coming after the lit. If I think the lit is bad, if I don't like the lit's message, I'm going to say it. But I'm going to rank the student based on the performance. I will use my feeling about the literature as a tiebreaker. So if your kid gets a 3 from Paul Porter and I say I don't like the literature, there's a chance that they would have gotten a 2. Yes, I don't like the literature, and that's my tiebreaker. But I will write that in a way that says, hey, listen, I just want you to hear my thought about this piece. I like what you're saying. Here's why I feel the way I feel. So in other words, can we get full sheets of paper? Because writing on these half sheets is not enough for me. And it's because I want to say these things, and I want to say these things with detail and nuance so that we have an open understanding of where we come from. Those are the things that make us better communicators. And I know this is a conversation that comes up a lot at IHSFA. I think that these types of realizations and understandings lead us to decisions that make us better nationally. I think if we take those steps and we take those risks and we invite those types of choices into what we do, we have a chance to be better on the national level. The question is, are we willing to do that?
And Paul, to piggyback on what you said, I was listening to the entire thing until, and I'm not bragging about myself, but until I took over as education chair, we didn't talk about these kinds of issues in IHSFA. And I think that's part of the problem that we have with our organization is that we don't have enough diverse leadership and people who are willing to open up their mouths and say, you know what, I'm tired of this. I'm making a change. This is what we're going to do. And we're going to start forcing the conversation. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest problems that I feel we have in this state is that no one really wants to push that discussion. And then when the season starts, we fall, like you said, into our habits. You know, the one thing that I've tried to do whenever we host a tournament at Ben Davis is invite new coaches who have no clue what the hell is going on into the office. And I pair them up with another experienced coach so they can learn, but they can also start getting into that connection, that network that JD's talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's important that those of us that are in the ups, that we open up the door to everyone else.
Yeah.
Especially if they see us judging around too. You know, if we're going to be on the board, I think it's important that people see us on the ground, that we're not too good to pick up a ballot.
I really think a lot of the ballot talk is important too. I know it was incredibly tough for me to hear from a coach, but I had a coach that I was so grateful to last year who came up and showed me the comments of one of my judges that I would have bet money that none of my coaches would have ever said anything like this on a ballot, but it was incredibly offensive. It was short-sighted. It wasn't about – it was all the things that Paul talked about seeing on ballots. And it gave me the opportunity to talk to that coach individually or talk to that judge individually and what we are about and what we believe our mission is as an organization, but also as a school, and how what they did hurt somebody and hurt them and didn't achieve any of our goals as an organization or as a school. But we have to be willing to do that because, you know, we often read the ballots to protect our students, but we don't get to see the ballots that our judges write on our school's behalf. And so it was one of the things that I was thinking about as you said that. There's so much power in what we say on ballots and what our judges say on ballots that if we're not aware of what they're saying, we don't know how they're using that power that we're giving to them to wield in those rounds.
Do you think some of that is that some of the judges are just not experienced and many of our judges are not teachers? And I think, I'm a teacher, so I'm used to thinking about what the effect that my words would have on that child, and I try to be open-minded and fair and really try to take my personal feelings out of the piece or whatever. And I think there are some people that really can't do that, and I find that very disturbing, and I don't know what to do about that.
I agree with Fred's comment and the thing. Absolutely, it is part of training. I don't know how we get to the point, and maybe this is the tough conversation that we have as coaches to say, if you see something that really unsettles you as on one of your students' ballots, you've got to have a pathway and a way to communicate that to the coach of that other team so that we can have this dialogue about really good ballots, really good feedback, and not using that power indiscriminately to hurt kids.
Paul, this is awesome.
Thank you.
So, you guys, and I hate to end this, and I'm sorry to interject, but
Okay.
it's 1:03, and Ben's workshop coming up is coming up pretty soon. So
Then I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. I look forward to, hand quotes, seeing you at tournaments this year. Let's have a great year. Let's work through COVID, and we'll all be back together again soon. So thank you so much. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul.